Okay, it's recording right now. Just wait a few seconds so everybody can get in before we start. Okay, so I think we can start. So hi everyone, welcome to our fifth team webinar. Today we are traveling to Northern Europe with Kerry Greaves. We are going to spend about 2 hours together to learn about women artists in the Nordic countries and the politics of gender in the welfare states. Maura Reilly will be moderating this talk. So Maura, you are here with us at the head of our team program, and you will probably say a few words about team. I didn't introduce myself, but my name is Anaïs Roche. I'm the International Development Manager of Aware. So I guess that if you're here, you already know a little bit about our organization, so I won't present it, but maybe just give a few updates about our activities. So the most important news maybe is that we celebrated the 2 winners of the Aware prize last Friday. And the winners are Gail Schwan and Barbara Chase-Riboud. We are very excited about it. I also would like to inform you that within a month, mid-April, we will be organizing a 4-day symposium titled Reclaim Narratives of African Women Artists. So I invite you to have a look on the program on our website. I will just copy the links in the chat box so you can read more about our prize winners and about our symposium. So Maura, I said that you were the head of the team program, but you're also a feminist curator and art writer. You're always committed to marginalized artists, both in your exhibitions and your books with an S. I would like to mention the most famous one, which is curatorial activism towards an ethics of curating, which was named Top 10 Best Art Book of 2018 by the New York Times. You're also working on a new book project, The Ethical Museum, to be published next year. So I've already spoken enough, so I give you the mic, Maura, so we can start the webinar. And I will share the screen so you have the 2 slides about team.
Great. Si bien, Anaïs. So welcome everybody. We're so delighted you're here, and I'm super excited to hear from Kerry and to learn more about women from the Nordic countries. I know very little, so I'm going to be taking lots of notes. So I'm here just to moderate, but I also want to tell you a little bit about team, which Anaïs mentioned just momentarily, or just very cursorily. So TEAM stands for Teaching, E-Learning Agency and Mentoring, and it's an international academic network that's the sort of brainchild of myself, Anaïs, and Camille Morino. And it's dedicated to the production and sharing of knowledge about women artists across the world. So as you all know, Aware is this extraordinary website that has this, encyclopedic presence dedicated to women artists. And the idea is with TEAM is to expand it and to enrich it with a priority given to geographic areas that are still underrepresented to date. So, obviously looking at African artists, South American, Nordic countries in this instance, et cetera. But the main goal, second goal really is to support the training of the next generation of art historians and those who are sensitive to issues of gender and who understand the importance of women artists. We really want to train the next generation to take this on as a key priority. So really, in a sense, is a network of solidarity art historians across the globe. So to date, the network is made up of 14 members or 14 professors. Kerry is one of them. And they work with 65 master's and doctorate students who are research artists from across 5 continents. So it's a very exciting initiative. We're really thrilled with the results. It's in its first year, and we hope to continue it. So that's a little bit about EAM and Kerry's involvement. And I'll give you a short bio of Kerry. I'm sure she has a really hugely extensive one, but I'll go with the short one that was provided to me. So Kerry Greaves is a Novo Nordics assistant professor in art history at the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen. She's also an external lecturer in art history at the Danish Institute for the Study Abroad. And her book, The Danish Avant-Garde and World War II, The Helbetston Collective, was published by Routledge in 2019. And then her current research focuses on Nordic women artists in the 20th century. And she's the editor, I think, coming out in a few weeks, of the book Modern Women Artists in the Nordic Countries, with more than 20 emerging and established international contributors covering the period from 1900 to 1960. So huge period of time covered. And really exciting new scholarship. So her current project, which I think she'll be talking about today, is called Feminist Emergency, which is a great title, Women Artists in Denmark, 1960 to the Present. And that's a multi-platform research project that she'll be talking about today. I did want to mention that Kerry received her master's in art history from the Courtauld and her PhD from the very prestigious art history graduate program, the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. So I will turn it over to Kerry. Welcome, Kerry. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Maura. Let me just share my screen. You can see it, yeah?
Okay,
yeah,
we're good.
And I'm just making note of the time here. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm very happy to be part of team. It's been really exciting. Also learning from my students and engaging my students, as Maura says, it is this kind of next generation that we're trying to engage. So it's been a really rich and rewarding experience for me and for them, I hope. I want to thank Maura for moderating, and Anais and Rose and Camilla for putting this all together and asking me to talk. So let me just get started here. So today I'm going to be doing a little talking, a little bit of reading. I'm not going to be giving a comprehensive account of all Nordic women artists, but I'm going to touch upon how my research has intersected with certain issues that I've come across, and how I came upon looking at women artists in this region. Let's see here. Also, I think it's important to point out that I'm a bit of an outsider to the region. I'm American, as Maura mentioned. I'm American, British American trained, and that has been, I think, a blessing. My colleagues have been very welcoming, and I perhaps have been able to see certain blind spots or things that might have been taken for granted by local art historians, and they've been very welcoming in my opinions and insights into this. So that's very much, I think, bound up with my research, and I'm particularly fascinated by the paradox of the welfare state, this image of Nordic liberalism, along with some of the realities of what it means to be a woman and a woman artist in these countries. And I find that very fascinating. Okay, let's see here. I will talk about how I came to this research, my past research, then I'm going to talk about the current project, what we're doing, my methodology, and then I will look at a couple of different exhibitions that I think draw out these themes that I'm writing about now. And then I'll touch upon some of the future initiatives of the project that we will be doing. So right now I'll go into the background. So the ongoing themes of my research draw from Danish and Nordic context to reconsider existing hegemonies of 20th and 21st century art and art history. My first way into this was looking at this artists group, Helhesten Collective, which were active during World War II, included artists such as Asger Jorn. This was a book project based on my dissertation, and I argued that this group, very little known, actually was incredibly important because it constitutes one of the few, if only, links between the pre and post-war avant-gardes, because they were active through the war. They were former surrealists and went on to become part of Cobra. In doing research for this book, looking at the interwar avant-gardes, and then the work they were doing during the war and just after, I realized towards the end that there were many women involved with these artists and these movements, but I knew very little about them, and I actually didn't write very much about them. So there was a kind of, I myself had a blind spot in doing that. And here you see just some of the artists involved. Franziska Clausen, who was incredibly involved in the interwar period with most of the major avant-garde movements and studios. And on the bottom, you have Else Fischer-Hansen and Sonja Ferlo-Menkoba and Else Alfeld, who were part of Helhesten and then went on to become part of Cobra. So I asked myself, if this is a radical alternative to the canon, what about the women? If it was so radical, where are the women, you know, and because there were women involved. So there were some unexplained absences. And I was surprised at how little work had actually been done on these artists. So I found that despite some important interventions, the exclusionary reasoning of Western canonical modernism lingered in Danish art history, perhaps because modernism came late to the region when compared to other Western European countries. And also because it is tended to position modern women artists as subject wives and muses first, artists second, implicitly rendering them derivative and of little consequence. This is now starting to change. And again, these are some of the artists. These are Danish artists that I looked at and have done research on. Rita Karen Larsen, Peggy Guggenheim gave her first solo show to her in 1938 at Guggenheim June. Franziska Clausen, like I said, was very involved. Sonja Ferlo-Menkoba was the first of these artists to actually go to Paris. She shared her studio was in the same building as Giacometti, and she introduced these men actually to these other figures in Paris that they became involved with. But because these women weren't necessarily concerned with the writing of art history and the theorizing in journals, although they do appear, they have tended to be written out of art history. There's a lot of info on this slide, don't panic. Aeneas has put a link in the chat. This research led to a project I called Otherwise, Danish Women Artists, 1900 to 1960. It resulted in, I expanded it and it resulted in a book on the Nordic region. And as Morris said, we have over 20 actually artists, curators, and art historians and critics writing on the different areas, different regions. Okay, let me just see where I am. So the book examines innovative women artists who were from or worked in Denmark, Finland, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sapmi, and Sweden from the emergence of modernism until the so-called second wave feminist movement took shape. The text addresses the culturally specific conditions that shaped Nordic artist contributions, brings the latest, okay, I'm not gonna read that part. And what these texts showed me is that if the perceived image of the Nordic region is that of a harbinger of social welfare reform, for women artists active there during the first half of the 20th century, the reality could be quite different, even as their circumstances differed from other countries, European countries. In the Scandinavian countries, the constitutional monarchies of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the populations were generally more homogeneous, political change was more reformist and less violent in nature, and the emphasis on social welfare and collective identity was important early on. And there was usually only one main capital, modest art capital, Copenhagen, what is now Oslo or Stockholm, where everyone knew everyone else. So this meant if women artists, usually through some kind of partnership or marriage, had some connections in the art world, they might do quite well. Otherwise, they did face the same conditions as women artists during this time, and they would go places like France or Germany to learn and enjoy a more liberal art environment. Let me just see here. Another interesting pattern that we see is that these women artists many of them were considered on par with their male counterparts at the time and during their lifetime, but were subsequently written out of the historical record by the art historians who constructed Nordic art history. And this is something that this book is trying to respond to. There's 5 thematic sections in the book, which you see here. These are some of the artists and the reproductions of images in the book. The essays explore how women artists negotiated the inherent ambivalences of the art movements with which they were associated to create individual, personal, and original artistic pathways that made important contributions to Nordic modernism. We also, in the book, we tried to dissolve the outdated distinction between so-called fine and applied arts. All kind of creative production are considered art in the book. So we look at media such as weaving, illustration, memoir notes, doodling. All of these are recognized alongside painting and sculpture. The artists covered in the book engaged in strategies and practices not normally associated with modernism, such as silence, peripherality, internalization, indigeneity, emptiness, feminine power, and subversive networking, among others. And they often combine these approaches with more recognizably modern procedures, including the push for democratic representation, self-promotion, rejection of tradition, formal and medial experimentation, individuality or group affiliation, eroticism, and so on. Such aggregate approaches were a strategic means of creativity, experimentation, and resistance in works that reflect complex and multi-layered subjectivities and experiences. I found in editing this book and going through the work of these incredible artists, along with the authors who write about them, that these practices, approaches, and identities are often not easily categorized, recognized, or documented. But the authors in the book do try to do just that. And I can talk more about these specific artists and works in the Q&A if people are interested. So now I'm going to move on to the current project that I came up with. So again, in doing research of these early modernist women artists, I assumed that more recent women artists in the Nordic countries had been very well documented. And again, I was surprised that actually this, except for some important interventions, this really wasn't the case. There's been no systematic addressing of these issues. So now I'll look at this, the project I've put together, Feminist Emergency, which is here. it became apparent to me that feminism appears at least in Danish, and I should say I'm speaking about the Nordic in general, but specifically also drawing heavily upon Denmark because that's my area. Within Denmark, I would say it seems that feminism seems to appear with each generation or every decade. There's a kind of intervention, whether it's a large exhibition or publication, and then it goes away again, only to be readdressed again. And I'm interested in trying to map that. Why do these issues go, surface and go away again? And I think that feminism often is, in general, considered a completed project in Danish art history, that women had gained their rights in the 70s. It's, Denmark is known for being a very egalitarian society. It's an issue we don't need to look at, but that's not the case. So this project wants to try and apply speculative, radical feminist art theory to Danish and by extension, Nordic art. The project will pose and attempt to answer a few of these questions. If there are more women artists with ever more opportunities working in Denmark today, then why are they still so grossly underrepresented in museum collections, exhibitions, and art historical studies? And I'll show you a few statistics in a moment. What does it mean to be a woman artist or an artist creating feminist art in Denmark over the last 60 years? And what can this tell us about the conditions of Danish culture within a globalized context? And then what can a study of women artists in such a seemingly liberal democratic environment as Denmark productively lend to international feminist art theory? And this has also been something that I've been deeply invested in. Many interesting, important, and radical things happened here. But if you don't know about it, you're not going to write about it. And so I really am trying to disseminate this. Much of what I write and publish is in English because I'm trying to disseminate what happened here to the larger art historical community. And I can talk about how I'm doing that in a bit. As I said, there have been some important exceptions and interventions. And one of the most important is this publication, View Feminist Strategies in the Danish Art World. That is now almost 20 years old. And it has an English section as well. I know they still have some copies. If anyone is interested, you can get in touch with me and I can get in touch with women. It's by this artist collective called Women Down the Pub. Women Down the Pub was is an artist collective where they got together doing various things like this publication, events, walking tours of Copenhagen from a feminist perspective, exhibitions and things like that. View gathered information and material about projects from the 1970s onwards that had been previously fairly inaccessible. It drew heavily, although it did go through the 70s up until the 2000s, it also covered heavily the that. I'm kind of looking at the two bookends to see what's happened, and then I'm going to go back in through. I should say I just started the project as well, so I'm at the beginning stages of the research for this project. And in the book, art historian Sanna Kofod Olsen writes, why we are sitting here in 2004 with the same dilemma we had 35 years ago is a paradox. The women's movement and feminism have shifted borders, but as regards to the writing of art history, there is still a palpable disparity of representation of the sexes in the visual arts that remains inexplicable. I would say that nearly 2 decades later, the situation remains more or less the same. So my project is trying to address why this is happening. These are just some statistics. You can see Over the last several decades, if you compare from 1983 to 2003, only 20% of female living artists were represented in the state Danish art museums. Now it's 22%. So there's only marginal improvements have happened. And so this is the thing, you know, there are more women artists working here than ever before. Why are we still seeing these numbers? For the Statens Museum for Kunst, which is Denmark's national gallery, from the period 2005 to 2012, of their 68 major shows, only 5 featured women. And I mention that because I'm going to be talking about the Statens Museum in a moment. So these are some of the artists I'm looking at in the project right now that I've started looking at. Just to give you a sense, and I will be talking about some of them. And I just want to talk a little bit about the methodology of the project, because it becomes clear to me that the feminist revolution didn't, as Sana writes, did not necessarily remap the art world in the ways that maybe we generally think it might have done. So as I mentioned, I'm really fascinated by the social welfare state and what is actually happening in the art world and how that works. I've looked at feminist scholars such as Mia Linason, where she and others have shown Nordic governments' promotion of the idea of equality was a neoliberal strategy for modernizing Scandinavian societies during the rise of the welfare state, resulting in gender being made a fundamental national value. But the expansion of Nordic women's rights has been problematically monopolized as an important but misleading success story in the making of the welfare state. Ideas of homogeneity and difference were still tactically deployed to enhance the well-being of the nation, while at the same time producing specific forms of exclusion and hierarchy that continue to exclude certain women seen as undesirable by neoliberalism, such as ethnic minorities or migrants. And I would say, at least in Denmark, there's also a governmental push and cultural push towards assimilation that is uncomfortable with questions of difference, resistance, or critique. And this is something that British art historian and curator Temi Odumosu has recently described as a weaponizing of tolerance. And I will talk about Temi, an exhibition Temi curated a little later. The resulting implicit view is that there's little need to reconsider women artists in terms of their gender, since they have already achieved equality and have been treated democratically. And this has even generated the idea that gender is a dépassé topic altogether. So as I said, this has meant that feminism has tended to be taken for granted as a historical succession of waves that already achieved its aims in the 1970s. I view feminism differently, or in addition to this, as Griselda Pollock, art historian Griselda Pollock has argued, feminism's mission to formulate a new political subjectivity in the world, and a project yet to come, or a creative space of difference that qualifies the project of democratization or emancipation. So in my work, I'm trying to apply an intersectional approach. I see feminism more as a speculative and analytical tool, one that can challenge and infiltrate given structures and forms of representation. Seen in this way, feminism is not just a set of peripheral issues or historical moments, but a fundamental, recurring, and active inquiry into existing cultural conditions around us and the writing of art's histories. The project thus foregrounds difference as an apparatus for conceptual and methodological experimentation into the sphere of art by women and feminist art in Denmark. The project is, as Maura mentioned, is doing various things. We've started already collaborating, of course, with Aware, which has been wonderful. We're also collaborating with Ariel, Feminisms in the Aesthetics, and that's local in Denmark, some young women curators doing feminist work here by emerging and experimental artists. We're also collaborating with Flame, which is doing something a bit similar, except specifically within the context of art museums in Norway. And then with EBCAF, European Post-War Contemporary Art Forum, we will have I will soon be hiring a postdoc, and we will be launching the book, I should say. The book comes out in a couple of weeks. We will have a book launch, and we will launch the Nordic Feminist Art Histories Research Network, which I've started and now has over 50 international members. We will kind of soft launch it, if you will, on Zoom with the book launch. And then in October, we'll have a multi-day keynoted conference, and I'm going to partner with EBCAF. So we'll have one day, we'll be looking at feminism and gender in post-war and contemporary art in a European context. And then another day will be focused on Nordic, specifically the Nordic region. And I very much want to have artists, critics, this will be multiple disciplinary, I hope, when we do this. And I can talk a little bit more about that at the end, this relationship between practicing artists and research in Denmark, which I think is quite strong, maybe unique, but very strong here. And I can talk about that towards the end. Let me just see here. So now I'll look at some of the current themes I've specifically been looking at in the project. Right now I'm looking at three different kind of ways into women artists in Denmark and the Nordic countries. The first 2015 at the Statens Museum for Kunst, which is Denmark's national gallery, that revisited the important radical feminist experiments of the 1970s. So kind of the beginning stages. Then I'm looking at Thresholds, an exhibition that was curated by Temi Odumosu at Camp, an alternative space very different from the Statens Museum for Kunst. I'll talk about that as well. And then finally, I'm going to be writing an article about the state of art history today in the Danish art history journal Periscope, with a theme on feminism and gender. And I think with that, I will take these first two experiments into account and then bring in View, this book that was so formative for mapping what happened in the 80s and 90s, and try to comment upon what's going on right now today. So my contribution will be a feminist take on art history today by looking at the Danish case. The What's Happening text will feature in an anthology on curating the contemporary in the art museum, which is edited by two of my colleagues, Christian Hamburg and Malene Vest Hansen. That'll be out with Routledge. And then the Thresholds article will have to do with an anthology currently being put together on democracy and contemporary European art. Okay. So I'm looking at projects that have made it into art history, but still need looking at and were fundamentally important. Let me just see here. So What's Happening was the first major exhibition to feature feminist and protest art made during the period 1965 to 75. And it took place in Denmark's National Gallery, which you see here, the Statens Museum for Kunst, along with some installation shots and an important work they featured, which I'll talk about. The museum was trying to address the debates around the changing notion of the contemporary in the art museum by focusing on women artists. So the museum realized to deal with this idea of the emergence of contemporary art, they had to take into consideration women artists. With the exhibition, the National Gallery gave feminist art an official stamp of approval and framed it as a crucial component in the birth of contemporary art. When art and artists moved away from conventional conceptions towards a moment when art, according to the curator Brigitte Annenberg, quote, began to realize its own temporality and context specificity, unquote. The exhibition covered many of the exceedingly radical feminist art provocations undertaken in Denmark, including no less than one of the first feminist art exhibitions in the world. And many of these artists that were covered are still active today, and some of them helped reinstall some of the works in the show. One of the landmark works was Lena Adler Petersen and Bjørn Nørgaard's happening, The Female Christ 2, The Expulsion from the Temple, a performance that took place in May 1969, just one day before the Danish parliament lifted a ban on visual pornography. A naked Petersen strode elegantly through the Copenhagen Stock Exchange while holding a cross amidst a crowd of shocked stockbrokers. The female Christ theme purposely called forth an ambiguous mixture of associations, from Christian tenets linked to women such as gentleness, love, and maternity, to eroticism and female sexual power. It's one in a series of provocative performances Petersen and Nørgaard put together, using the body to challenge institutions and accepted norms. The Female Christ 2 was a strategic feminist intervention into Danish commerce and characteristic of second wave feminism of the period, which focused on issues of visibility, gender parity, performance, and the female body. Petersen's nakedness, combined with her confident carriage, poignantly underscored the female body's fundamental threat to the patriarchy, as well as its capitalist exploitation, and literally raised the traditional female nude off her back into a purposeful and powerful force of movement. Other feminist artists of the 1970s were featured, like Ursula Reuter Christiansen, who's still active today, who undertook a radically ambitious project that called into question the very premises of the avant-garde, even as they attempted to adapt some of those movements' tactics, such as performance video and happenings, to their own ends. Christiansen's film, The Executioner, and I should just say here you see a still from the film with remnants from the film itself and prints and stills that she made later installed in the show. So her film, The Executioner, is one of the most powerful feminist art films of the period. It explores in an eclectic and nonlinear style the uneven role of power between women and men from a woman's point of view. It featured the work of, starred, and was narrated by Christiansen, who unapologetically reflected on the nuanced and complicated nature of what it meant to be a woman in 1971. Two profoundly important feminist exhibitions were also partially reinstalled in the 2015 show. Images of Women in 1970, as I mentioned, one of the first feminist exhibitions in the world, and the Women's Exhibition of 1975, a multidisciplinary show that included readings, discussions, and works by international and local figures. Images of Women took place in a small cellar in the Royal Academy, now known as Charlottenborg Kunsthal, as well as a nearby temporary exhibition space. The show emerged in connection with the activities of the local Red Stockings feminist group, which had been co-established by some of the participating artists. They had met as students and instructors at the Academy, and included Rika Diemer, Kirsten Dufour, Jutta Keller, Gita Skjold Jensen, Kirsten Justesen, Jutta Rex, Lena Bill, and Maria Biel. The exhibition consisted of 7 tableaux, each of which was comprised of a thematic installation and event, which unfolded over the course of the exhibition. The tableau subjects included themes such as the whore, dishwashing, beauty, the defense, the garments, the camp, and the celebration. They contemplated contemporary female identity and moved from themes of oppression to those of freedom and liberation. In one of them, which was partially reinstalled which you see it from the original, a still from the original show here, but reinstalled in the 2015 exhibition, the artists lived and worked with their children in the academy, for the basement of the academy for several days. The tableau also consisted of things like a peep show, self-defense classes, collective working, and process-driven practices such as sewing, poster, and image making. Taken together, the tableau constituted a major shift in collective avant-garde experimentation, as well as a provocative gesture of socially critical visual art. And you could say this was done in what feminist theorist Nancy Fraser has described as second wave feminism's emancipatory power to politicize the personal, which is often quoted. These women explored the creative act as suggesting new ways of looking and thinking about the position of women in society. And as curator Brigitte Annenberg points out, the exhibition also marked a radical shift in neo-avant-garde practice, in which the tableau and actions do not only work as images, they're also the radical staging of the exhibition space also makes them a platform for confrontation and involvement. And I'll come back to that idea of confrontation and involvement in a minute. The women's exhibition in 1975 also occurred at the Royal Academy, and was more of a socially activist event that included artists. It emerged out of other social activist events of the year before. It was an ongoing collective festival with events, readings, discussions, and meals. They were actually given 25,000 kroner, which today would be, I don't know, $3,000 or something, but funded partially by the Ministry of Culture, so publicly funded. And they received 25,000 paying guests. The artists involved called a cultural historical portrait. They wanted to educate visitors and included amateur and non-artists. And the events and the works compared traditional and current forms of female dress, crafts, motherhood, women's groups and issues. It had a cafe, discussions, meetings, and performances. Here, the radicality of the show drew from its democratic and broad-ranging approach to an art exhibition as a social, political, and educational event, where the visual was just one aspect of the experience and the message. The 2015 exhibition made the period's feminist work, the historical feminist works, visible to a new generation of Danes and put them on the art historical map. I think that the museum also purchased several of the works in the show, trying to shore up their collection of women artists. However, they were exhibited in the context of concurrent male-dominated avant-gardes like pop and minimalism. You can see a little bit of that here. The aim for the curator was to generate a new discourse between the two factions. While a refreshing dialogue was perhaps created in the process, the emancipatory feminist activism, or as I mentioned earlier, this confrontation and involvement that was embedded in the original works was institutionalized within a patriarchal and nationalist framework. And this, of course, is a common problematic concerning the curation of feminist art in the art museum. In response to this problematic, I suggest an alternative approach to the work's curation by recalling philosopher Hilda Heine's application of feminist theory to redress the art museum. According to Heine, feminist theory can rethink the art museum because of its open-endedness, its inherent pluralism, its renunciation of universalism, and concomitant lack of finality in ways that can transform museum visitors to undergo the museum experience unencumbered by the conventional rules that command our complicity, by remaining engaged and self-aware, resisting the impulse towards fantasizing or consumption. And I would say that this more recent, and of course it's the National Gallery, so there's a whole set of politics embedded within this, but I think it's productive to look at this and still probe and problematize what they're doing. And I think Thresholds is an exhibition that perhaps does do what Hilda Heine was calling for, even though it's not an art museum and it's an alternative space outside of Copenhagen, on the outskirts of Copenhagen. It is now since closed, unfortunately. But this exhibition, Thresholds, which was curated by Temi Odemosu, also touches upon issues of gender visibility and representation, like the earlier exhibition, within the context of the Nordic welfare state. The exhibition was a provocative intervention into the entangled histories and conflicts of the Nordic region, its colonies, and problematic relationship with those deemed unrepresentable by the state. And here you just see the cover. This is a work underneath a work by Pia Ark, which I'll talk about. And this is the camp, the space here. And these are events related to the exhibition. Let me just see here. Okay, so the exhibition was curated by Temi Odemosu and featured 5 women. Greenlandic Danish artist Pia Ark, Jamaican Danish artist Michelle Eistrup, Korean Danish artist and activist Young Son Gulat, Brazilian, Norwegian feminist activist and performance artist Luanda Carneiro Jacoel, and Ethiopian Swedish designer and artist Saba Bereket Persson. I just want to make a note here, that camp was the art site of Trampoline House, which was an activist site for migrants and displaced people in Denmark. It just also recently closed, unfortunately, because of lack of funding, but it was active for 10 years. And it had some of the most provocative, in terms of art, exhibitions in the country during that period. And it was, Trampoline House was actually started as an art project by the curators Tone Olaf Nielsen and Martin Goll. And Tone Olaf Nielsen and Frederica Hansen, here's Frederica here, she's was the in-house curator with Tone of camp. They are part of this collective Curators Action, which I will talk about a little bit later, but they have been invited by Documenta 15 to take part in this theme of the Lombong, several other artists by the Jakarta-based group Run Grupa. So camp has closed, but at least Frederica Hansen is actually curating, is working with Documenta. So their work does continue. And this is Temi Odemosu here, the curator of the guest curator of the show. Thresholds manifested a compelling contact zone for making visible how we negotiate difference in terms of identity, community, and belonging in post-migrant Europe, especially in terms of race and gender. In 2019, the notion of what it meant to be a good representable Danish citizen was increasingly called into question through an unprecedented influx of migrants from non-European nations, growing questions about the supposed gender equity of the Nordic region with regards to the global Me Too movement and the welfare state's move towards capitalism, privatization, and deregulation, or neoliberalism. This was at the end of a period art critic Jonas Ekberg calls post-Nordic, when a growing tension arose between the protective social democratic welfare state and globalization. I think that the curator and artists involved with Threshold engaged with an agonistic feminist approach through the artist's exploitation of their own triply othered racial, colonial, and gendered identities in their work, as well as the show's activation of difference as a means for authentic participatory community building, and its critical engagement with the larger post-Nordic issues that I just mentioned. The exhibition's two prominent themes were the idea of the threshold or crossing, in addition to the colonial female body, and how these two ideologically laden arenas give rise to experiences of displacement, difference, visibility, and othering. The included artists make up the region's earliest and most important decolonial feminist artists and thinkers who address geopolitical bordering by tapping into their personal biographies and how they converge with local and wider political and historical contexts, revealing how cultural and national belonging is being negotiated in the Nordic region today. I'll just talk about briefly three of the artists in the exhibition. Pia Ark, the Greenlandic Danish artist. She appears actually in the book that I mentioned earlier. Her work is, even though she's after 1960, technically, her work is contextualized by a Canadian art historian, Chrissa van Haringa, within the context of Greenlandic modernism in a very, really interesting and important way. But Pia Ark was incredibly important for Danish art history. Her work deals with the silences into which she was born, surrounding the Greenlandic-Denmark relationship by using her own body and personal story. She graduated from the Royal Academy with a thesis titled Ethno-Aesthetics, which helped introduce post-colonial discourse into the Nordic art world by challenging European identity from a mixed female subject position. She's interested in how it is to live, and it was interested, she passed away unfortunately, in an in-between space from the perspective of the insider and outsider at the same time. And Curatorisk Action, Tone and Olaf Nielsen and Frederica Hensen, they actually curated in 2010 a very important exhibition about Pia Ark, documenting her work that they actually won the year's Art Critics Prize for that exhibition. And I'll talk about, there's going to be a retrospective of her at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art this fall here in Denmark. And I think that's where we will have our conference, actually at Louisiana, in conjunction with this show. And these are just three works. She does she does different things. But works such as Old School Map deal with the ambiguity of this double vision, seeing oneself plurally through a photographic lens and negotiating a colonial imaginary by way of family and institutional archives. She appropriates maps of Greenland, augments them to represent the enmeshment of Denmark's colonial history with her own biography. And then in Untitled number 11, it's a double exposure of a portrait of her in an interior. The photos are kind of self-portraits that have been exposed more than once so that the artist appears as her own ghost. And then this, it's very hard to see, but she puts songs of traditional Greenlandic lyrics of songs onto this pinhole photograph that she has taken. Yang Sun-Gulash is a Korean-Danish artist and activist with a focus on transnational adoption as an expression of colonial structure in the Western part of the world. The star child represents a durational performance of what she describes as a ritual burden, which she experiences through live scarification. She had this performance at the opening of Thresholds, and then it was represented through photographs. She physically attaches objects that obstruct balance, bodily balance and movement. The tactility of the materials, shapes, and Kerry's references to the colonialization of Southeast and East Asia, while focusing on the female body and the commodification of her womb and sexuality, asking us to consider how a modern body can also be a document of colonial reference. And then finally, Sabah Barakat Persson arrived in Sweden from Ethiopia, age 12. She draws on these experiences to engage memory, gender, identity, estrangement, and home in her textile-based conceptual works. She deploys fashion as a mode of protest against sociocultural norms, but she also combines it, as you can see here, with performance, the spoken word, and then the installation of these. It was an installation consisting of textiles on mannequins and a performance video examining the unconscious discrimination she experienced based on her experience living in Scandinavia with a minority skin color. Okay. See what I have. And then I will just say that I've lost my last page of notes, but just to mention, these are some upcoming things. So, you know, in a sense, things are happening, but I think part of the role of my project is to document these things and create a platform that they are accessible continuously and made visible. So there's an exhibition coming up after the silence, Women in the Art of Crisis, at the National Gallery this summer and fall. And then, like I said, this Pia Ark retrospective at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art. And I'm hoping that the conference will, I'm in talks with Louisiana that we will be there, and I'm going to approach the Statins Museum. And the website of our project will hold recordings of these conferences. We will document these collaborations. We plan to interview living artists and collect the interviews that have already been done, which are scattered all around. And yes, I think I've come towards the end, but this is just a kind of brief background of what I've been doing here on the subject. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kerry. This is incredible. It's what's so frustrating about these webinars, I have to tell you, is that you can't hear people clapping. So Anais and I will clap for everyone. That was incredible. I took like 3 pages of notes, so thank you for that. and I will most certainly purchase the book, and thank you for the 20% discount. We all love that as academics. I think you'll see some increase in sales after the webinar. But it was really wonderful. I have a million questions. I'm sure that Anais has been keeping track of those I'm hoping from the audience as well. And if you haven't asked any questions, please put them into the chat or private message to Anais. But I wanted to, well, first of all, I wanted to mention that Tona Olaf Nielsen and Frederica Hansen are old friends of mine. And they are absolutely like 2 of the most brilliant curators working today. And I'm so thrilled that Federica is being included in Documenta, because a lot of people in the US don't know about just their incredible kind of decolonial curatorial strategies, and their dedication to feminism is really interesting. I curated a show with Federica on a global queer exhibition at the Schaedhalle in Zurich when she was a director there. So I'm a big fan of hers. So I was delighted to learn more about the Threshold show that they did at camp. And I really appreciated hearing about these amazing artists. I mean, just that kind of thorough overview. They're incredible. And I actually don't know of any of those artists. So thank you for that additional knowledge for my encyclopedia in my brain of women artists. Really interesting how you framed it as the kind of, the colonial female body and its exploration therein. I wondered, whether in light of that, will your Feminist Emergency Project with its, intersectional approach include sort of Inuit and Sami women and migrant women of color? Because it's this one exhibition has clearly like exploded the discourse in Denmark or even in the Nordic countries. But will that be like, I'm assuming that'll be kind of an integral part of what you're going to be producing as far as knowledge. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I have several colleagues in my department who are working on these issues, not necessarily with the female body, but with these issues of post-migration, post-colonialism. And it is a very, I didn't go into it, but it's a very heated topic here at the moment. So part of the way that I positioned my project when I applied for the funding was that I want to be part of this dialogue with these other scholars. And CAMP has done several exhibitions like Thresholds that are just so rich and provocative, and they have documented these exhibitions. So that was just one. And yes, that is definitely my plan. It's much easier to do now. If you go back in time, at least in Denmark, things are much more homogenous, and it's very difficult to find these artists who were working because
on the peripheries.
Yes, so I've actually had trouble with that, but it is definitely it's a goal of mine and the project. Yeah,
it's interesting. I recently interviewed Claire Barlow, who curated the Queer British Art Show for the Tate, and she was discussing these sort of historical sort of erasures. And how a curator can go back historically and reclaim artists that were already excluded on the basis of race and sexism. So how do you recreate that history for a system that was inherently so misogynist and racist? Like how do you find that material? It's like the storage units and the basements is how she phrased it. And it's a really impossible and difficult project.
I think that there are people here, and this is where I get to draw on my colleagues and I should say, one thing that strikes me about working here is that there is such a collaboration between artist practitioners, curators, and art historians and theorists working together that I find very, very strong and unique. And also it's a very small environment. So I could just was in conversation with someone last week who's actually documented some of these artists that I don't even know and did it 10 years ago. And it is in someone's basement or studio. And so I'm going to try and pull this together. I mean, it's a big project. I mean, I have 4 years, but, and I keep saying we, but right now it's just me. But I am definitely going to try and do that because there are so many people who have done the work, some of this foundational work, and I need to try and put it together. So in that way, the project is, of course, my own research, but it also, I'm more and more viewing it as a kind of machine or platform for making visible what has already been done.
Right. It's brilliant. And you mentioned something too that was sort of, I don't know, kind of struck me, is you said that a lot of people are working on post-coloniality. And that's become such a kind of hot topic here in the US because there are a lot of folks that feel that a post-colonial approach is actually inherently problematic, and the decolonial approach is actually the way to approach colonial subjects. And so it's interesting, and I'm wondering about that dialogue. I don't know if you know enough about kind of the kind of debates in and around post-colonialism and decoloniality, but it's, the idea is that there's post-coloniality, there's too much of an emphasis on the colonial system. So therefore you're almost like inherently too dependent on it. So it's kind of interesting. I'd love to hear about that in another context. I don't want to put you on the spot about that, but I did want to ask, what are the differences that you notice, between the contemporary art environment for women artists in Denmark compared with other contexts? Like I'm thinking of the US, like where women are equally underrepresented. They're equally discriminated against, right? I mean, almost identical history of misogyny that's embedded into the art system. So there are many similarities, but what are the like kind of end realities? But what are the differences, you think? And are there any?
Well, I think one of the main, I mean, from my point of view, one of the differences is that here there is funding. You can apply for funding and get funding. So there are so many talented women artists working and have been working and doing really incredible things. It's just not systematically done or addressed. It's become a big issue here. You know, that New York Times article came out about representation of women, and Denmark had the same series of kind of articles about that. And the city of Copenhagen, for example, has now had a gender parity legislation for the purchase of artworks. And there was a debate about that. Yeah.
What? Can you tell us more about that? I don't think people know that.
Yeah, well, it's very recent. I think it was a bit debated because, again, there's this debate about whether gender should be an issue when purchasing or, you know, works of art, and that always pushes back against that. But I don't know if it's the mayor or of the city, for their public purchases of art, now they have a quota to make it more even. But that's city of Copenhagen. That's not, you know, the larger.
No, but that's really unbelievable. That's a kind of extraordinary development. And I don't know any other country that would, or even city that would make that sort of commitment. You're talking about sort of state-run galleries where it's, you know, kind of state funding. So therefore
purchases for the city. So like public art, commissions for public buildings, things like that, parliament, because there's, I mean, like I said, there is a lot of funding for, I guess I noticed this as an American, where there's so little funding, that there is funding here. You have to apply, but there's well-worn system ways of going about it, and so that these things are happening.
But it's not trickling down into the museum system. You showed the statistics of solo exhibitions, right? And I wonder about gallery representation, right? I mean,
very similar.
So the wonderful, but that's a huge like positive sign that at least the mayor or whomever is supporting that kind of gender parity. It's really extraordinary. I hope it trickles down into all these other aspects, because that's really where the change needs to happen. It's interesting you mentioned funding too, because I lived in Australia for a long time, and you know, the funding there is extraordinary for artists. So women do phenomenally well. Again, not as necessarily kind of visible in the art system at large, though. So we still have a little ways to go to kind of match up that funding with representation.
Visibility, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know, Anais, do you have some questions that have come through?
Yeah, we have one question from Willy Schwartz. I don't know if I pronounce it well. So I can't read it. Excellent
Wiley.
talk. Really enjoyed this, Kerry. Thank you. Curious how you selected the specific artists that you wrote about in the book, and to what extent do they represent a holistic or comprehensive archive of radical female artistic practices during your time frame?
For the book, which is the earlier part of the 20th century, it's not comprehensive. And I write in the introduction that actually this is what I learned from these essays, is that each of these countries, it's just the beginnings of researching these artists. And some of these artists were academic artists, but perhaps engaged with more activist activities outside of their artistic professions, living together, taking on, you know, male persona and things like that. So it's just the beginning, actually. And in some ways, I would say it's in the introduction, I try to draw it together, but it's eclectic because it reflects the state of the research as it is now. And I mean, the Nordic region isn't that large. I have most of the people working on this stuff in the book, so it's what they're working on now. But I think this thing that I said about these different strategies of silence, peripherality, interiority, that came out in different ways with many of these artists, these kind of creative ways of negotiating what I have called a double bind, where, you know, some of these artists were affiliated with very avant-garde groups as well, and these supposedly radical revolutionary groups that still were exclusionary towards women artists. And so they had to get very creative of how they negotiated that. So I think that the authors in the anthology really, there's a breadth of things that are covered. And I should also say Sonia Ferlo-Menkoba, who's a very important Danish sculptress here in Denmark, who is a member of Cobra, an earlier surrealist. She's covered a bit heavily in the book because it was paired with a conference and a retrospective on her work at the National Gallery. So she's featured a bit heavily, but yeah.
But when you're doing sort of groundbreaking work, which is all new research, you can't be comprehensive. I remember when I was doing global feminisms, everybody was like, you forgot so-and-so. And I'm like, you're kidding me? I'm covering the globe. I had to be a little selective. So it's like, you know, when you're doing that kind of work, right? It's like, it's the kind of work you could dedicate your life to. You just keep growing the knowledge, right? You keep growing the number of artists, keep working towards comprehension.
And there's so much I don't know. And I think also what is wonderful about the kind of art world here is that because it's still very small and most people know everyone else, I was very quickly able to build a network and call upon people. I don't have someone from here. Can you write on someone from Greenland? Can you write on a Sami artist? And I was able to do that. So in that way, it's that kind of intimacy of which still is, you know, compared to a place like New York, still can be beneficial. Yeah.
I don't know if there's another question. I just want to jump in though and ask one that I think would be useful for people on the webinar to hear, which is your choice of the word emergency and how it relates to the Birkbeck conference, which people might not know about. The idea of it being an emergency is something like this could be called Feminist Emergency Nordic Countries, and every single person on this call could have Feminist Emergency : their country, because we are really in a kind of urgent situation globally for women. So I'd love it if you could give the context for that.
Well, yeah, I totally took it from the Birkbeck conference, but because of the way that they framed it, that, you know, there's this, I had colleagues saying to me, feminism isn't over. Look at the Me Too movement, it's everywhere. And it's like, but it's also completely taken for granted in so many ways. Look at those statistics. And so I felt that term reflected that dichotomy or that paradox that we're in now, that it actually is an emergency. We still need to look at these things. We need to address them. And I also thought that could put a little fire under the Danish. Danes are very calm, and I don't know, to really say this is something that needs addressing. It terribly needs addressing. There's been a handful of important, as I said, interventions and works, and people are all working and they know one another, but we need to do something about this. And we need to look at these things critically in light of things like Me Too and globalization. And I mean, because things are always already gendered, and it's not a dépassé thing to talk about this. We do need to look at it. So,
but it's all the more interesting given your region's liberal image. I mean, as you made so clear, right? This ostensibly like women are equal, right? But like, and I like that you chose emergency in that context because it really hammers home, right? It really kind of alerts people quickly to like, there are still issues. Like, I think one of the things I loved about the Birkbeck conference though was the way that they emphasized it. And I think that, again, everybody on the call can relate to is the emergency is really about the fact that, you know, women are still getting less salary. Male violence permeates every aspect of society. You know, the bigotry, racism, misogyny that Trump threw into high relief has trickled to and spread to many countries if it didn't already exist. So it's like these things they're urgent. They're so urgent. And so I like that you did that. I really like that you use that word.
Yeah, I have to say, to admit, that I was really surprised by the gap between the statistics and the image we have from these countries. I mean, we can imagine that there is not a perfect gender equality, but the gap is so huge that I was really surprised.
And statistics are so important.
Yeah.
For that reason.
And there were more I could put in. I mean, I filtered out for simplicity, but the statistics are there.
I always say that counting and statistics are a feminist strategy, because people will always argue like, oh, women have achieved equality. Look at Marina Abramovich and Cindy Sherman. And you're like, those are token achievers. Look at the statistics. It just throws into high relief how wrong people are when they say that we're achieving equality.
Well, and I think also what's been really inspiring for me is that my students are so interested and dedicated to this subject. And through my work with team, but then also now I'm advising, you know, bachelor and master's theses and papers they do. I'm just completely inspired by my students' interest and work in this subject. It's really, and they teach me things. There's things I have no idea what's going on. You know, the kind of really ultra, underground stuff that's going on. So I think it's an issue that is very, very permanent to the next generation as well.
My hope is that the next generation will carry the torch, but as we know, and you discussed, like, we have to keep fighting the battle because there's always a backlash. So every 20 years or so, we have to like jumpstart the exact same conversations. And then it dissipates. And then we have another generation, like our generation, Kerry, that jumpstarted the Linda Nochlin conversation, right? So I just pray that one of these generations will really, really be able to make the kind of change that we all aspire to.
Yeah, and what we can see when we do some research on this topic at Aware is that it's really a non-linear story, history. I mean, there are some moments that are better or than others, and it's not, I mean, we always have to keep fighting, because when we change, you go to another generation, you also have to transmit the knowledge and the achievements of the other generation. So,
and it's also different, like when you say nonlinear, it's also different per country.
It is,
you know, it's so radically different. The level of attention paid to women artists or feminism is so radically different from, that's what I tried to get at with global feminisms. You know, feminism in Guatemala is not the same as feminism in Denmark. So how do you account for those intricacies as well when you're trying to institute global change?
True. I have another question from Willie again, asking, how can one join the Nordic Feminist Histories Research Network?
You can email me.
Okay,
you're open.
Copy your email in the chat.
She has my email. It's Wiley. I think I know her. So
okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Let's all join it.
We're open. We're open.
Even if we know nothing about it, can we join it?
Yeah, I mean, well, what's very heartening for me is I contacted a lot of people, and newspaper critics, artists, curators, and students, and people are very interested in doing that. So I'm hoping, you know, we can do some really good work with those conferences.
Oh, keep us all posted.
I would also say, I mean, one thing that's been inspiring for me in doing the book is that the way, as I mentioned, it breaks apart, looking at these artists, it breaks apart our understanding of canonical, for lack of a better word, art history. So looking at artists doing things it's just not, as someone who's trained in modernism, that's very difficult to categorize, you know, remaining silent, remaining on the periphery so you can stay experimenting your work, staying out of the debates of the avant-garde so you can get about your work and do it, you know, and just do it rather, you know, or, you know, being an activist in suffrage or, you know, in women's rights, but also being an academic portrait painter for the bourgeoisie, and almost having that as a kind of facade, a cover so you can do your other work. And so things like that, I mean, they're just really opened up my eyes about what's going on, you know, what these artists are doing that we know so little about.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about those kind of choices that they made, because, you know, I worked closely with Kerry on many projects, and she or marry like an artist, you know, in the, like, you know, in the scene at the time, because she knew, like you said earlier, that spouses, particularly wives, were just sort of like, I mean, sort of like Louise Bourgeois, right? She was married to Robert, what is it, Goldwater, and didn't get any recognition, you know, until much later in life, because she was considered his wife. So these kind of decisions are really, they're really important that you've been outlining, that women artists have to make to grapple with the system, personal decisions.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, for example, the surrealist Elsa Thoresen, she's a Danish surrealist, was important at the time in all of the debates. She was married to Wilhelm Bjerke Petersen, who was the main voice of surrealism in Denmark and was an important surrealist theorist here. And she was important too, and doing really important work. They got divorced. She disappeared from art history. So she was recognized at that moment, and she was working. And but subsequently, until recently, her work just became invisible. So those are very real. Those things have very real repercussions, and for people working.
Yeah, and like Brian Sewall, who wrote for many years ago, said that women artists can never achieve greatness because they have children. I mean, right? It's like this idea that your children take precedence over your art practice, so therefore you can't achieve greatness because you're focused on something else. But no one ever says that about men, that they have children. They also have children. So, I mean, there's, like you said, the double bind. It's like women can't win, right? We did have another question. Did you want to take it, Anais?
Yeah, we have another question for you, Kerry, from Clara Langer. Thank you a lot for this presentation. Do you think there are some important differences in the treatment of those issues between the Nordic/Scandinavian countries?
Good question.
I knew I was going to get this question. I think it depends very much on when you're looking, what period you're looking at, and when. I will say, for example, Sigrun Osbo, who was written in the book, writes about this idea of how gender became a dépassé topic to even talk about in criticism, even as there was a kind of gendered rhetoric in art criticism. So that happened in Norway, which a little bit different. It was a little bit different here. I don't think I can make that generalized a statement. Actually, talk to me a year from now in the project, and I could probably have a better answer for you. That's also why I'm wanting to contribute with my colleagues to try and, because obviously there's an issue. Flame had all kinds of statistics in their application for their research project about the representation of women in Norway. So it's something that is persistent throughout these countries. It's not hugely different, I would say.
Okay, we have someone.
Our final question, right?
Well, we have someone, Wayon Caruso, who started a question, dear Dr. Mara-Reilly, but I don't have the question. So maybe if you want to raise your hand, I can pass you the mic and you can ask your question directly. I don't know if you hear me or, yeah, perfect. So here you go. You can ask your question, but you have to turn your mic on.
No, I was very interested in presentation, but also I was very interested in Dr. Maura Riley's comment you said about global feminism, right? So one country feminism can be different from another country's feminism. I wrote my dissertation about the Korean feminist artists.
Oh, wow.
In my dissertation at Columbia University. So I wrote a few articles. I also wrote a Chinese woman feminist artist in this Aware magazine, but I didn't have a chance to put a Korean artist. But Dr. Maura Riley's comment is absolutely, I agree with it. Different country, Asian country, European country, American feminisms are little bit different because we have a different religious background and political condition, especially Korean feminism based on Asia Confucianism, so very much patriarchal based religion, I'd say philosophy. So it's very interesting you mentioned that, Dr. Riley.
Oh, wow. Thank you for saying that. And God, your research sounds so important. I would love it if you could put some of it in the chat. I hope that you also had the opportunity to read Joan Keyes or Dr. Joan Keyes' contribution to global feminisms. She's
Yes.
a really brilliant scholar who wrote about, and interestingly, apropos to what you just said, she spoke about how women in many Asian countries are reluctant to even use the term feminism.
That's right.
So that's another example of how, right? I mean, you can't make these kind of universal statements about a global feminisms or sisterhood when some of the women would even claim to be feminists.
Yeah, a very, very interesting talk by Kerry Greaves. But my total dissertation was about the Korean first feminist artist Song Nam-yoon, her work just put it into Washington Smithsonian Museum too. Wow. So yeah, so that was my dissertation. This I love Aware very much. I respect.
I think it would be great though if you wouldn't mind putting your dissertation or something in the chat. That would be wonderful.
Should I put my email?
Sure.
Chat? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, then I put on my my name.
Kerry, I have one more question. It's from Jana Maniva. She'd like to ask if you have any context and information about Balkan women artists.
No, but no. I will say this, but you could be in touch with me. I have a colleague working on Eastern European. I have some colleagues working on this that could have some more information. And I would say Marina Abramovic, she was in one of those early exhibitions I showed you very early on. She had a performance in Copenhagen that was later very, very controversial. So she was actually represented here quite early and part of these shows. So.
That's great. I think, Anais, that might be the last question, yeah?
Yeah, we just have one comment from Anita Mizrahi. She said, thanks. Look at Hilma Hafklin from Sweden, who had her frame just now after more than 50 years.
We have...
or Cameron Herrera, who's 100 and just got recognized.
We have Hilma Klint in the book. And also there's someone finishing her dissertation, doing a really kind of different reading on that artist as well, who was in our department doing some research for a while. So there's work being done, more work being done there. Also the very important artist, Hannah Rugen, who did tapestries in a social realist, semi-abstract style. And her tapestries were shown in juxtaposition with Picasso's Guernica in 1937. Wow. And hers were, they folded over part of the tapestry. It's fascinating. She's really getting some attention now. A book written about her has just been translated into English. So we have a chapter about her in the book, and also I actually have a couple of students writing about her now just extraordinary artists. So a lot of these artists are and what's so wonderful, I mean, from an art historian's point of view, is there's so much work you can do. I mean, I can spend my whole career just looking at the artists in the book, you know, I mean, there's just so much rich work that can be done. So I find that really inspiring. I hope that it inspires further research into these artists, because some of them are the first essays that have been written about some of these artists. So
wow.
We did a little cartoon for children on Hilma Hafklint.
okay.
Yeah. So children can start learning about women artists at an early stage.
Yeah, great.
I passed the link here.
Oh, there's one last question we should probably take, but I think we might have gone over at this point, Anais, but from Malene Vest Hansen, regarding the concept feminist, how do you address the women artists who don't want to be framed as feminists anymore? For instance, Kirsten Justesen, who's also Danish.
Thank you, Malene, my colleague. I think it doesn't have to be as problematic as it seems. I think I'm more interested in the structures surrounding these women and their production and their reception. I'm calling them feminists because in a sense they are, according to those structures. If they don't want to be seen that way, then of course, I think you respect that. But I think I understand why they're saying that. They want to be seen as artists. They're sick of being seen as women artists. But my job is to find out what were the conditions of their production, reception, and historiography of their work. And I think that requires me to look at them as feminists, because they, in that sense, they were, while also respecting the fact that they are artists as well, first and foremost. But it is a problem. I mean, it's also discussed in the book by several artists. I mean, this is something that you come up against, and I'm sure you have as well many times had to deal with this.
Many times, global feminisms, it was major. It was 88 artists from 62 countries. And many of the artists didn't understand why we were putting them in a feminist show, including Tomoka Sawada, who is a Japanese artist whose work is like in the lineage of Cindy Sherman. It's all about, you know, deconstructing gender. And we were like, really? But what it was is that in Japan, or in her context where she lived in Osaka, you know, that there was no discourse about it. There was no real conversation about feminism. And in fact, the conversation was really repressed. So when Linda and I kind of, using an interpreter, described to her why we thought her work fit into that matrix, she was like, aha, yes. You know? So, but it's interesting because some are very resistant and don't want to be included. In fact, Georgia O'Keeffe did not want to be in the Women Artists exhibition that Linda Nochlin curated in 1976 because it was women artists, like you said. She just wanted to be an artist. And they got around it by borrowing a work from a collector, and they included her anyway. So, I mean, these are bigger issues, right? Do you include them? Do you not? You know, but again, like you said, I think feminism can be thought of as a methodological approach that you can apply also to an artist, even if he or she does not identify it as such. But it is a complicated question, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree. I'm still going to use that word because it's how I approach this work, because it's also about othering, and it's about difference, and it's about visibility, rather than perhaps a self-identification as such. And when I call someone a feminist artist, I'm not saying they're not an artist first and foremost. I'm looking at them through a specific lens. So it's not in any way taking away, I don't think taking away from their identities as artists first and foremost. It's an added way of looking at what they were doing and how they have, you know, the structures around what they are doing. At least that's what I'm interested in.
And also historically too, in your case, I'm assuming, although no, the word feminist etymologically would have arisen in Denmark and Nordic countries during the modern period. But when you look at someone like George Sand, or someone from, literary figures from French history, the word feminist wasn't even really in circulation in the 1830s, right? So it's that as well. So, and how do we utilize terminologies that post-date the production of the work?
Yeah.
So those are issues too that I'm sure you think about, when you're looking at historical work.
Yeah, and that came up in the book, and different author. I think that's what's so beautiful about an anthology, is that different authors dealt with it in different ways according to the specific context, so that there's no one overarching answer of how to do this. Of course, I've read every single essay because I had to edit it, and but to me, it became this just really enriching scope of things, that not comprehensive, but so expansive in a way. And they all deal with these questions in the book. Yeah.
Well, we all need to buy the book.
We do.
And Aware will take it for its bookshelf. You have an amazing library, so.
Exactly. Okay, so I think this was the last question we had. So thank you again, Kerry. This was
Thank you.
Great to take time to learn more about your research and the new project. I'm really excited that Aware will be part of the project, and I hope we will contribute to it and help spreading the word and sharing the results of the research. And thank you again, Maura.
Sure.
For being here always as our head of program.
Happy to help.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kerry.
Brilliant job. Thank you so much for sharing your research.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to the audience. So please keep in touch, and I hope to see you for our 4-day symposium in April, and we will have our next team webinar maybe in May, because we already have 4 days of Zoom webinar in April. So the next team webinar will be on women artists from the Middle East with Seren Ospinar in May. So we will send you the information very soon.
And talk about an area of the world where they don't use the word feminist. So that'll be really interesting.
Really excited about this webinar too.
Too.
So thank you again, Maura. Thank you, Kerry. See you.
Thank you,
soon.
Elise.
Take care. Be safe.
Bye.
Bye.